BC here for BC Nephro. Thanks for watching. I'm Dr. Brian Cronin, board certified nephrologist and clinical specialist in hypertension. Today's topic, base deficit, what it is and how to use it. So let's get into it. There are three ways to assess and diagnose acid base disorders. The first is referred to as a physiologic approach. This is the approach that I use and the approach that most nephrologists use. For more information on this, check out my video and article on acid base overview. A link to those will be in the description below. But there's two other ways to assess acid base disorder. One is the physical chemical approach, which is referred to as the Stewart method or the Stewart model. And the third is the base excess approach. People often refer to the base deficit because it's reported on the blood gases, and I typically don't pay attention to this because I use the physiologic approach. But since it is reported and referred to, and also is an important risk predictor in certain clinical situations, particularly the trauma setting, it's important to understand what it is and how to appropriately use it. So I'm going to share with you what I learned. First, although base deficit is often referred to, what the blood gas is reporting is base excess, and what it really is reporting is something called this standardized base excess. So what is base excess? Base excess essentially is the amount of a strong acid that needs to be added to a liter of normal blood to restore the blood to normal acid-base balance. That is to make the pH 7.4 and the PCO2 40. Standard base excess has a correction factor for hemoglobin. Now, hemoglobin acts as a buffer, and in the body, hemoglobin is only in the intravascular space, but in the blood gas sample, in vitro, it's in all the space. So the standard base excess corrects for this buffering capacity of hemoglobin outside the body in vitro. Now, the blood gas reports a base excess. What a base deficit is essentially a negative base excess. So a negative base excess of 10 is a base deficit of 10. Now, how to use it? There's a threefold approach in using the base excess to diagnose acid base disorders. This is compared to the 6-step approach that I outlined in the physiologic method, although these 3 steps have kind of sub-steps, so it turns out to be pretty much the same. Step 1 is to look at the pH, PCO2, and base excess to make an assessment of what the primary disturbance is. This refers to 2 of the steps in the other approach, which is what is the emia, that is the pH, and what is the osis, is there a metabolic or respiratory acidosis or alkalosis as the primary disorder. So first, look at the pH. If the pH is low, there's an acidemia, which means there's a primary acidosis. Then you can look at both the base excess and the PCO2. A normal base excess would be -2 to +2. If the base excess is more negative to -2, then there's a primary metabolic acidosis. If the PCO2 is above 40, then there's a primary respiratory acidosis. Likewise, if the pH is alkalemic above 7.4, you look at the base excess and the PCO2. In that context, if the base excess is more positive than +2, there's a primary metabolic alkalosis, and if the PCO2 is less than 40, there's a primary respiratory alkalosis. So looking at this, there's 2 reasons for a negative base excess or a base deficit, just like there's 2 reasons for a low serum bicarbonate. One is a metabolic acidosis, and the second is a compensatory response to a respiratory alkalosis. Step 2 is to look at the compensation. Now, just as there's compensatory formulas in the physiologic approach, there's compensatory formulas for the base excess approach. Going through this. For a metabolic acidosis, the expected change in PCO2 is whatever the change in base excess is. So if your base excess is -10, then your PCO2 should be 30. If your PCO2 is higher than this, 35, 38, 40, 45, that's not normal, and that means there's an additional primary respiratory acidosis. For metabolic alkalosis, the expected change in PCO2 is 0.6 times the change in base excess. Now, for respiratory disorders, there's formulas for acute and chronic, just as there is in the physiologic approach. Now, essentially, for acute respiratory acidosis or alkalosis, the predicted change in base excess is nothing. It should be -2 to +2, essentially 0. For chronic disorders, either respiratory acidosis or respiratory alkalosis, the expected change in base excess is 0.4 times the change in PCO2. Now that we've completed the first 2 steps, we get to the third step. So the third step is to calculate or partition the standard base excess. That is to attribute how much of the base excess is due to free water, how much is due to chloride, and how much is due to albumin. And there's formulas for all these. You subtract them all from each other, and based on this partition base excess, you find out if there's something else going on. Now, since free water in the body is determined by the serum sodium, this is really a different way of saying the anion gap. So in the anion gap, you're looking at the sodium, the chloride, and you may be correcting it for albumin. So instead of memorizing or looking up these formulas to partition things, you may as well do what you already know and calculate the anion gap. So in both approaches, if the anion gap is elevated above 15 or 20, there is an increased anion gap metabolic acidosis present, regardless of what the bicarbonate is, regardless of what the pH is. Then, if there is an increased anion gap metabolic acidosis, you can take further steps, as in the physiologic approach of looking at the delta-delta and looking to see if there's an osmolar gap to diagnose what exactly is going on. So that's it, base excess, what it is, and how to appropriately use it to diagnose acid base disorders. Let me know what you think, leave a comment below. Do you prefer the base excess approach? Do you prefer the physiologic approach? Do you actually even use the Stewart method, physical-chemical approach? And if you made it this far, you might as well hit like and subscribe. And if you found this video useful, informative, please share it with someone else who you think might learn from it or want to learn from it. This really helps the channel grow, word of mouth, and until next time.